Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen and I am an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I prepare these videos every week as a way to prepare for taking my mind and moving towards the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the week for the assigned daily text of the Revised Common Lectionary. This coming Sunday is August 31st, 2014, the 12th Sunday after Pentecost, and the assigned gospel text for this week is Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. Now, this is a direct continuation of the story that was featured last week in the lectionary, which was verses 13 through 20, and if you heard that video, you also heard that I included verse 21. Along with that, so we kind of have a little bit of an overlap between these 2 weeks and these two stories. Now, what's going on in the story? Jesus has been traveling around for a while. He is kind of shifting gears in terms of his ministry of just traveling around the countryside, and now he is turning his face towards Jerusalem. His 3-year ministry is almost completed, and it is time to head off to Jerusalem, where he will experience his arrest and his torture and his eventual crucifixion and resurrection. What happened previously in the first part of the story is Jesus has asked the disciples who the people are saying that he is. He then narrows it down to ask them who they say he is. And the focus of last week's video and sermon was that. Who do you say that I am? Jesus poses that question to us as believers as well. The interesting notion from that is Peter makes his confession that you are the Messiah, or you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus Jesus is overjoyed with this proclamation from Peter and really kind of lifts him up in that. As the story shifts gears in verse 21, at the beginning of this week's text, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day rise again. So we have heard that the disciples, or in the very least Peter, has made this marvelous confession of the true identity of Christ. And with that knowledge of who he is comes knowledge of why he came and what his mission is. That begins this passage. Once Jesus has begun to say that, Peter shifts gears. He takes a complete 180 from what he had just said and rebukes Jesus, saying, "Certainly, Lord, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. You must never be killed. You cannot be. That's not what the Messiah is going to do." Jesus then looks at Peter and utters the very famous, "Get behind me, Satan. You have become a stumbling block for me. You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." It's kind of what the narrative of the story is. Jesus then goes on to talk about, if any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will save it. There's that passage, or that short section. And then it talks about that the Son of Man is going to come into the glory of his Father with the angels and will come again to repay everyone for what has been done. And then he says, "Truly there are some standing here that will not taste death until the Son of Man comes into his kingdom." That is the passage, kind of the narrative of what is happening. Now, there's a lot going on in this. Obviously, a lot of the focus goes to Peter and his rapid turnaround. How can he make such a strong confession, such a truthful confession, such a wonderful confession according to Jesus, and then turn right around and start rebuking Jesus when Jesus tells him the truth of what his earthly mission is? It seems very strange to consider that, and we wonder exactly what is going on. Now, there's a couple different directions that the sermon might go with this, or that I might go, but just some of the things that are happening. This is really an indicator of how unable we, as limited, finite humanity, are to understand the work of God, to understand the plan of God, to understand the steps that God is going through to reconcile humanity to himself. The knowledge at the time of what the Messiah was and would be was mostly limited to an earthly ruler or an earthly deliverer. There's a lot of parallels painted between what the expectations were for the Messiah and Moses, who had freed the people or led the people out of Israel and into freedom and in the ancient times. And now there was thought that with the Roman Empire being the ruling factor, that the Messiah would be a political ruler or a king in the line of David who would free Israel and set up a true monarchy or a true kingdom that would be separate and free from Roman rule. But obviously that was not what was going on. This brings to mind the notion of the story of the road to Emmaus in Luke's gospel. After the death of Jesus, the two disciples are walking down the road, and as they encounter the risen Lord and don't know it's him, they're talking about him, and they say, well, we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And this seems to almost kind of point the same direction. And perhaps that's what Peter is squawking at, because if the Messiah is killed, well, it's over as far as his human reckoning goes. So perhaps that's where he's coming from. But the language in this text is interesting. And I explored that a little bit this week, and especially with why does Jesus call Peter Satan? Is he literally saying, Peter, you're the devil, knock it off? Or is there a little something else going on here? And as I looked at that and just did a little bit of work in the Greek or playing with some of the different language, it pointed out an interesting notion, particularly in the first verse, in verse 21. Jesus began to show his disciples. What does it mean that he shows his disciples that he has to be killed, that he has to suffer and be killed and then rise? And I looked at that a little bit, and another translation for that is he presented it, or he taught them. And so it's not like he was demonstrating, though that's kind of what our language indicates, but that he presented this notion that he will be killed. And I looked at some of the other occurrences where that same word is used. And another one is in the temptation of Jesus, right after his baptism, when Satan is tempting Jesus. And Satan shows Jesus the kingdoms of the world and says, all these are given to me. I give them to you if you'll bow down and worship me. He presents the kingdoms of the world or shows them to Jesus. Same thing. And an interesting point with that, if we skip to that story and kind of look at it a little bit, when that story occurs in Luke's gospel, it indicates that Satan left Jesus when all of the temptations were done. However, here in Matthew's gospel, that is not said. It just says Satan left it, and it doesn't tell us that the temptations are over. I thought about that some, and then I came back around to this passage today in chapter 16 and thought about, does he say, get behind me, Satan, because this has nothing to do with Peter, and this is Satan still tempting Jesus, still working on him, still trying to derail God's planning, God's attempts to reconcile humanity. You know, as I mentioned before, our understanding of what's going on in the spiritual realm is mind blown, and we don't comprehend. We don't know what's going on, quote unquote, behind the scenes, what Satan is still up to. We just know that Satan hates God's plan. Satan hates the fact that through Christ our sins have been forgiven, that we are reconciled to God, and that he loses dominion over us because of that. And so in this story, I find myself wondering, is that what's going on? Is Satan still working on Jesus, still tempting him, still trying to get him to step aside from the plan that is laid out by God to go to Jerusalem and suffer death on the cross, and in doing so, taking the sin of all humanity upon himself? Is that what's going on? And Jesus recognizes that Peter is being used as a tool, perhaps his doubt or his fears or his misplaced expectations, whatever. Satan's using that as a tool to trip up Jesus. And that's what Jesus is talking about? Or is he literally saying, calling Jesus, or calling Peter the devil and saying, hey, you're becoming a stumbling block to me, knock it off? I don't know, but that was an interesting exploration to go on, to realize that we have a God who loves us so much that he will go to any lengths to reconcile us. And at the same time, the enemy hates that so much and despises God so much and despises humanity so much, but wants to have continued dominion over humanity, that he will go to any length to try and trip up God in his plan. It's interesting. That's kind of a point that's made there. But on the flip side, another thing is just, as I mentioned earlier, that Peter just cannot comprehend what's happening because his expectation of the Messiah is so flawed. And I'm also thinking about talking about that notion that oftentimes our expectations or our hopes for what God will do in our lives or for us or around us or whatever are so limited. They're limited by our finitude is what they call it. They're limited by our understanding, our lack of ability to understand, our lack of ability to look beyond our own selfish desires. We limit God, whether we mean to or not. And it seems that in this case, Peter is trying to limit Jesus. Peter is trying to limit the Messiah. And we see other instances of this as well. It also happens in the foot washing, which is present in John's gospel. Peter tries to tell Jesus what he can and cannot do, and that's not up to us. So perhaps that's why Jesus puts Peter back in his place on this. Those are some of the things that are going on. I am not quite sure exactly where I'm going to go with the sermon yet, but those are some of the things that are happening in this passage, and it's interesting. We could look at it from the standpoint of spiritual warfare happening in the realm of of Satan and God. We could also look at it from the perspective of looking beyond our limited expectations, or looking at the notion that perhaps the good news, and where I may end up going with this, the good news in this is that we have a God who creates life out of death, even if we can't understand that as Peter can. Peter seems to miss the fact that Jesus says, I'm going to be killed, but then I'm going to be raised again. There will be new life that comes out of death. And not only for me, Jesus, but for all humanity because of Jesus. Peter misses that. And I think oftentimes we do too. Perhaps the good news is not that we have a God that prevents death, physical death, mind you, but that we have a God who cares enough to create new life out of death because God mourns that reality. There's been a lot of instances throughout our congregation of death or pain of various sorts, and I may speak to that as well, but we have a God who does not deny those things and who does not stop them from happening, but that we have a God who mourns it enough and cares enough about our pain to enter into our reality and do something about it. That's perhaps another angle that I'll go on. That's kind of what's happening this week, what I'm thinking about. If you have any thoughts or questions or comments, by all means, please share them down in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, I hope that this has been helpful in wrapping your head around chapter 16 of Matthew, verses 21 through 28, as Jesus talks about his mission of going on to Jerusalem to be killed and then raised again. Otherwise, have a wonderful week, and I look forward to hearing from you, and God bless.